Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 deals with personality and persuasion, and there are various personality attributes that can shape the way in which we are persuaded and how effective attempts to persuade us might be. So let's take a look at some of these personality factors that can shape the persuasive process. One thing that's very interesting to consider is the human tendency to assume that other people are more susceptible to persuasive attempts than we ourselves are. So this is kind of an interesting dynamic, and it's something that's worth paying attention to. Certainly, if we perceive that other people are more likely to be persuaded than we are, then we might not be as critical about persuasive messages that we receive because we think that maybe we have some kind of inherent ability to be less persuaded, right? The research actually shows that there are several factors that can influence persuasion. One of these is definitely self-esteem. Another issue deals with intelligence, and gender has also been found to play a role in persuasion. So we'll be talking about each of these one by one. Now, you might assume that if somebody has lower self-esteem, that they may be more gullible or more open to being persuaded than someone who has moderate or high self-esteem, right? Well, maybe not. McGuire did research in self-esteem and persuasion, and what he found is actually people who have low self-esteem tend to be less likely to be persuaded by a given message. And he hypothesized that the reason for this deals with the fact that they may be too preoccupied or distracted with thinking about their own personal problems, or perhaps how they don't measure up, or maybe considering what they lack, that this type of an internal preoccupation that people who have low self-esteem may be going through will decrease their ability to attend to a message, and thus will make them less likely to be persuaded than someone who has moderate self-esteem. Again, his theory was that this is primarily because the person with low self-esteem will be preoccupied or distracted with thoughts that dwell on themselves and surrounding themselves, or what they can or cannot do, or what's right or wrong with their life, rather than thoughts that would be attending on the message. Now, in comparison, people who have high self-esteem are also less likely to be persuaded, but this is for a different reason. People who have high self-esteem are also more likely to assume that the stance or the position that they have on an issue is the correct one, and they probably have more self-confidence in themselves than someone who has moderate self-esteem. So for these reasons, and they are very different reasons, people who have low self-esteem tend to be harder to persuade, and people who have high self-esteem are also more difficult to persuade. This is a very interesting issue to consider as persuaders. What this means is that we want to construct our message in a way where we are able to potentially target people of medium, low, and high self-esteem backgrounds, right? Every campaign is different, and every message will have a different overarching goal that you're trying to convey, but this is definitely something to consider as students of persuasion. Now, as McGuire found, people who tend to have middle levels or moderate levels of self-esteem are more likely to be persuaded because they are capable of both thinking about the issue from an internal standpoint, so they're probably having cognitions about the issue while the issue is being discussed by someone, and they're also able to focus on the external aspect of the persuasive message. So the person with moderate self-esteem is able to balance, if you will, the internal and the external focus that needs to play out in order for effective persuasion to take place. Another thing that's important in terms of self-esteem is the role of a person's topic or their expertise in life. So for example, it may be that even someone who has low self-esteem is more likely to be persuaded, especially if somebody is delivering a speech that's on a topic that they know a lot about, right? So if I have potentially low self-esteem, but you are giving a speech and you're seeking to persuade me about something that I know a lot about, and I'm able to engage in the topic because I'm an expert in it, I might be more likely to tune into your message, right? Rather than having thoughts about myself, I will be more likely to tune into your message. So in that sense, the role of topic and potentially expertise could also play into this matrix. Intelligence. Intelligence is another issue that can shape persuasion. Although people do not want to publicly admit this tenet, there are several people, including researchers, who make the case that people who have a lower intelligent quotient, or they are less intelligent, are more likely to be susceptible to persuasion influences. Rhodes and Wood did some research on this in 1992, and they did verify that people who are less intelligent are more likely to be persuaded. However, Gardner followed up with research, and one of the questions that Gardner asks about this basic assumption about intelligence and persuasion is that people have different types of intelligence, right? So, for example, somebody who has a very high math score or someone who's very good at mathematical calculations, right? Although they may be brilliant in that area, perhaps their interpersonal intelligence or their verbal intelligence is not so high, right? So in that case, somebody who is very skilled at mathematics would probably be harder to persuade if it had something to do with mathematics or science or something that they knew a lot about. On the other hand, if it was an issue that dealt with a social issue or perhaps during an interpersonal communication exchange with one other person or a few other people, that very person who rates very highly on mathematical science intelligence may actually be very susceptible to persuasion in interpersonal conversations because perhaps they're not as skilled at interpersonal relationships or interpersonal persuasion attempts and things like that. So it's very interesting to consider this whole idea of intelligence and different types of intelligence and how they can influence persuasion. Personally, I tend to be persuaded by people who are good communicators, right? Communication is obviously very important to me. It's what I dedicate my life to trying to teach other people about. And so somebody who is very well spoken would be very persuasive to me, right? Now, some of you may be very good at scientific or mathematical formulas and things like that. So in that sense, somebody who's able to illustrate certain types of mathematical principles or equations or formulas to you, they may be more persuasive to someone like you. So I think that this drives home the point that we always want to know who our audience is, not just with things like race background, culture background, age, things like that, but it's probably also in our best interest to figure out what's the basic or the generalized intelligence level of our audience, and also, are there different kinds of intelligence that people may have in the audience? And if we know that, for example, you're giving a speech and you're going to be talking to engineers and you're going to be talking to college professors and you're going to be talking to people in the community who are community activists, what this means is you would probably want to design a campaign that targets those different types of preferred intelligence indicators. So we can think about intelligence in terms of how we design our campaign so that we can reach the maximum amount of people most effectively. Gender. Gender influences persuasion in some interesting ways, but not in the ways that you might suspect. Research in the past, or researchers in the past, used to theorize or speculate that women were more susceptible to persuasion because they were just simply the weaker sex, or that they were taught or socialized to be persuaded because they were supposed to go along with the social agenda or things like that. But the reality is that women have actually not been found to be more easily persuaded than men. And in fact, this research was confirmed when Eagly and Carley did a meta-analysis in 1981. And a meta-analysis, if you haven't heard that term before, is basically where a researcher or a couple of researchers, they look across all of the research that's been done on a particular topic, and they compare the results of every study with the results of other studies to see, for example, does the research on persuasion and gender actually show that men and women have different tendencies to be persuaded, okay? So they probably looked at maybe 100 or 200 studies or something like that that had already been done on sex, gender, sex, and persuasion. And what they found actually is that most of the research established that there were no differences that were based on gender in terms of whether someone was more likely to be persuaded. What they did find in their meta-analysis was that women were more likely than men to be persuaded when they were sitting in a group than when they were sitting by themselves. This was especially the case when the women knew that other people were going to know what their vote was. So results like this really highlight the importance of social groups and the way in which social groups may influence our own ability or tendency to be persuaded. And I think one thing we can take away from this finding by Eagly and Carley is that even ourselves, when we are in a group of people, whether it's a family group or a friend group or a classroom or something like that, it's very likely that our own conclusions may not actually be our own conclusions, but they may actually be conclusions that go along with the group consensus, right? So this is one of the reasons why we want to be conscious of tendencies like this that are established in the research so that we can be more cognizant of some of the factors that we might not be aware of that can shape our own persuasion. And in doing this, we're able to develop a critical lens where we assess messages that seek to persuade us carefully, and we're conscious of the way in which the social group or the family group around us might be shaping the conclusions that we come to. Another thing that's useful with this finding is we can use findings like this to influence our own ability to persuade other people, right? So if I know, for example, that women are more likely to be persuaded in groups, especially when other people are going to know their vote or what they say publicly, then I might want to set up a campaign that allows women to look at a persuasive message or to listen to a persuasive message when they are sitting in a group with a bunch of other people, right? If I'm trying to convince the group of something and I know that women are more likely to be persuaded in a group, the chances are that women who are in a group will be more likely to be persuaded than women who are sitting alone watching that message, right? So I can use these kinds of findings for my own advantage for persuadability and my ability to convince people to adopt a given attitude, belief, or behavior. Need for cognition is another important personality issue that can shape how people are persuaded. Now, need for cognition is not the same as intelligence, and so we do want to discuss what it is so that we don't get them mixed up. Now, intelligence, or IQ, is something that we're all pretty much familiar with. You have an IQ quotient. You can take standardized tests that can measure your verbal ability or your mathematical ability or your logic ability or things like this, right? A need for cognition, it deals with people's preferred type of processing with regards to listening or hearing messages. So people who have a high need for cognition tend to have a desire to engage in mental energy or mental dialogue, okay? So if I have a high need for cognition, I want to be thinking about the argument logically. I want to know details about the argument, right? I have personal motives about this issue that might be guiding or driving whether or not I want to think about it and what kinds of thoughts I have about it. So people who have a high need for cognition are much more likely to be persuaded by messages that are more in-depth, that have more detail, and obviously that are very logical and have a good amount of scientific data backing it up. People who have high need for cognition are more likely to recall more of a message or a persuasive argument afterwards, okay, so they retain information better than people who have a low need for cognition. They also tend to generate more issues or more ideas that are surrounding the issue in their heads. So when you're giving a speech to people who have a high need for cognition, those individuals are more likely to have thoughts, right? Thoughts and ideas and conclusions going on in their mind while the message is playing out in front of them. Finally, finally, people who have a high need for cognition are also more likely to seek out more information on complex issues than someone who has a low need for cognition. And all of these factors can shape how it is that people are persuaded. So, how does the need for cognition influence persuasion? Well, as many of you have probably already concluded, those individuals who have a high need for cognition are much more likely to be influenced by a message that has good quality information, logical information, scientific-based information, details about the topic, right? These are all things that are going to be much more influential for someone who has a high need for cognition. Now, interestingly, there was a study done, and you can follow along on page 228 in your book if you wanted. There was a study done by Green and Associates in 2008, and what Green and Associates found is that people who have a high need for cognition are much more likely to be persuaded by print media, right? And you think about print media, such as the newspaper, and you have to read it, first of all, in order to understand the message. So there you're engaging cognition there. But there's also probably more details that you can glean from a newspaper article than from a 20-second ad, right? So Green found that people who have a high need for cognition are more likely to be persuaded by a print media venue than something like a film venue. Now, interestingly, following up on this print media versus film, those who have a low need for cognition were more likely to be influenced by a message that was placed in a film venue than a print venue. So now remember, those people who have a low need for cognition are not wanting to process things in a really systematic, deliberative, careful way. So what this means for persuasion is that those who have a low need for cognition are more likely to be influenced by heuristic shortcuts, right? What does this mean? Well, if you have a good source that's credible, they're going to see that as something that's persuasive. If you have attractive spokespeople, that's going to be persuasive to someone who has a low need for cognition. If you use a celebrity appeal, that's also going to be attractive and persuasive for someone who has a low need for cognition. So I think it's interesting that you can actually influence target audiences depending on what venue you choose to use for your persuasive message. And I think that given what Green and colleagues found about the fact that high need for cognition people were more likely to be persuaded by print, whereas low need for cognition people were more likely to be persuaded by film, these are findings that we can take into our own daily professional or personal lives so that we can enhance the persuadability of the messages that we are developing ourselves. We can also think about our own tendency to be persuaded and how and why we are persuaded by certain types of messages over others. Self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is a very interesting and important idea to be aware of as effective speakers and effective communicators. Self-monitoring is the ability to tune in to the various types of social or contextual cues around us and the ability to adapt appropriately so that we match the behavior that is expected in a given situation. Self-monitoring also deals with our ability to be conscious of how we're communicating, when we're communicating with people, and people who are good self-monitors are also good at reading people's responses to their communication. And the benefit in doing that is that if you need to modify or change the message in a way where your audience is able to receive it better or hear you more effectively, if you are a good self-monitor, you can see that your audience has missed something, right? So with me as a lecturer, as a professor, I do a lot of public speaking and I do a lot of self-monitoring in this process to make sure that I'm communicating appropriately and that I'm using examples that are effective. But I also like to look at the audience on a regular basis and keep the connection with the audience so that I'm able to see, are they following me? Do they understand? Did I make my point clear or is it confusing? And if I start to see that people are confused, I can repackage the same idea in a different message format so that people are able to understand it. Also, if you start to see your audience tuning out or falling asleep or you start to see their eyes glazing over, you can start to try to keep things more interesting, right? You can use things like volume. You can walk around the room to keep people alert. You can ask more questions to get your audience involved. You can even take a 3-minute break and have people get up and stretch and do some jumping jacks, right? To try to get the energy level up in the room. So if you're a good self-monitor, you would definitely be more effective in a variety of persuasive and communication situations. Obviously, people vary in their self-monitoring ability. It is a skill that you can teach yourself and that you can improve upon, and so that's the good thing. So generally speaking, people who are low self-monitors are less concerned with fulfilling roles and less concerned with adapting effectively to the different communication situation that they find themselves in. People who are low self-monitors place a premium on being themselves, being able to be genuine in who they are. However, people who are high self-monitors are very concerned with the roles that people are expecting them to fulfill, and as a result of this, high self-monitors are also very good at adapting their behavior for the various social or communication situation, and in doing this, they tend to be very effective communicators in many situations. High self-monitors and low self-monitors are persuaded in different ways. People who are high self-monitors are more likely to be persuaded by messages that convey a socially adjusting attitude value, such as a message that emphasizes the need that people have to fit in with others, or that try to pitch a certain type of a program or persuasive idea as something that helps people to fit in with others. On the other hand, low self-monitors tend to be more persuaded by value-expressive attitude functions, which allow people to be themselves or to be genuine. So this is not surprising given what we have found out about high self-monitors versus low self-monitors. So this issue was actually researched by Kenneth DeBono, and what Kenneth did was he surveyed all students prior to doing his study, and he wanted to see whether students generally opposed or supported the institutionalization of people who have a mental illness. So he surveyed the students, and what he found is that people in general opposed institutionalizing the mentally ill. So then what they did is they created 2 different types of persuasive appeals that would pitch the argument of institutionalizing the mentally ill, but emphasizing different types of values in the pitch. So for example, for the high self-monitors, they created a message that allowed people to look at institutionalizing the mentally ill as something that is considered to be the socially correct thing to do, right? However, for the low self-monitors, they created a message that stressed the values of responsibility and loving and underlined the favorable attitudes towards institutionalizing the mentally ill. Okay, so for example, the mentally ill people or people that we know who have a mental illness should really be able to be themselves. And if we institutionalize them, they're able to hang around people that are more like them, and so they don't have to worry about having to pretend like they're something they're not. Okay, that would be a message that's a value expressive attitude. So of course, what they found is that the high self-monitors were more favorable towards institutionalizing the mentally ill after hearing the socially adjusted message, whereas people who are low self-monitors were more influenced by the value expressive appeal. So what this teaches us about persuasion is that we would like to know what kinds of audiences we're talking to, because it's very likely that different types of appeals will work on different types of folks. And so we want to file this away as we're developing our campaigns, and also in your future when you're dealing with career and public professional communication. Dogmatism is another personality trait that influences whether a person will be persuaded and how they will be persuaded. People who are highly dogmatic tend to accept established ideas. They tend to accept the testimony of an authority person. They tend to perceive that there is only one correct opinion about a various issue. People who are low in dogmatic tendencies are much more open to new ideas. They have a desire for the truth and for a strong, coherent argument. And those who are low in the dogmatic assessment are more likely to see flaws or willing to acknowledge flaws in their argument in an attempt to discover the truth on a various issue. Now, in comparison, people who are highly dogmatic, again, are very conventional. They tend to establish and they tend to accept established ideas that are often put forth by authority members. And someone who is highly dogmatic will actually accept the testimony of an expert even when the argument is weak. So this is also something that we can file away in terms of our ability to persuade other people. And we might even want to consider where we fall on this value trait or on this personality trait, because if we tend to find that we are low or high in dogmatism, then we may want to look at how we are persuaded and decide if we want to be persuaded in the ways that we have been persuaded in the past. Another personality issue that can shape persuasion is the need to evaluate. People who have a high need to evaluate tend to evaluate social experiences as either good or bad, okay? They tend to have lots of opinions about things. They enjoy having these strong opinions about people, situations, issues. And so this does influence persuasion, right? We can think about how someone who has a low need to evaluate may be actually less likely to take a strong position, or they're less likely to make judgments about people or different situations that they encounter. So we can think about how the need to evaluate can shape someone's persuadability. Or how does our own need to evaluate something shape what kinds of things we are persuaded by? These are all very worthy things to think about. A few other issues that influence how people are persuaded deals with the need for affect, and a need for affect deals with whether a person experiences things on an emotional level. They may like to be emotionally tuned in to how they're feeling, and they usually are good at expressing their feelings. They also perceive that emotions are an important element in effective relationships and effective communication. Also, we can look at a person's need for closure. So people who have a high need for closure are those kinds of people that need to have a definitive answer. They like to work through a solution more quickly, right, rather than having ambiguous, sort of open-ended issues that are not dealt with or managed or decided on, right? So what we can think about as we conclude this chapter is, do we have a high need for evaluation? Do we tend to exhibit this evaluation tendency in our communication and in our persuasive interactions, whether we are delivering a message or receiving a message? Do we have a high need for affect? And if we do, how is that shaping our ability to persuade other people and also our tendency to be persuaded? And finally, are we someone that has a high need for closure? And how does that tendency shape our ability to persuade other people and, of course, our own tendency towards persuasion? These are all very important personality issues that all of us are influenced by. I hope that this lecture has provided you with some useful information in terms of developing your effective communication campaigns. And on a broader level, I hope that this information has allowed you to understand a little bit more about why it is that you yourself are persuaded in the way that you are. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a great day, and I'll talk to everyone in the next chapter.